There was one I remembered about a young man who once upon a time went hunting, and all the day he and his hounds hunted everywhere, and they crossed the rivers and went into all the woods and went round the marshes, but they couldn't find anything at all, and they hunted all day till the sun sank down and began to set behind the mountain. And the young man was angry because he couldn't find anything, and he was going to turn back when, just as the sun touched the mountain, he saw come out of a break in front of him a beautiful white stag, and he cheered to his hounds, but they whined and would not follow, and he cheered to his horse, but it shivered and stood stock still. And the young man jumped off the horse and left the hounds, and began to follow the white stag all alone. And soon it was quite dark, and the sky was black, without a single star shining in it. And the stag went away into the darkness. And though the man had brought his gun with him, he never shot at the stag, because he wanted to catch it, and he was afraid he would lose it in the night. But he never lost it once, though the sky was so black and the air was so dark, and the stag went on till the young man didn't know a bit where he was. And they went through enormous woods where the air was full of whispers, and a pale dead light came out from the rotten trunks that were lying on the ground. And just as the man thought he had lost the stag, he would see it all white and shining in front of him, and he would run fast to catch it. But the stag always ran faster, so he did not catch it. And they went through the enormous woods, and they swam across rivers, and they waded through black marshes where the ground bubbled, and the air was full of the will o' the wisps. And the stag fled away down into rocky, narrow valleys where the air was like the smell of a vault, and the man went after it. And they went over the great mountains, and the man heard the wind come down from the sky, and the stag went on, and the man went after. At last the sun rose, and the young man found he was in a country that he had never seen before. It was a beautiful valley with a bright stream running through it, and a great big round hill in the middle. And the stag went down the valley towards the hill, and it seemed to be getting tired, and went slower and slower, and though the man was tired too, he began to run faster, and he was sure he would catch the stag at last. But just as they got to the bottom of the hill, and the man stretched out his hand to catch the stag, it vanished into the earth, and the man began to cry. He was so sorry that he had lost it after all his long hunting. But as he was crying, he saw there was a door in the hill just in front of him. And he went in, and it was quite dark, but he went on as he thought he would find the white stag, and all of a sudden it got light, and there was the sky and the sun shining and birds singing in the trees, and there was a beautiful fountain, and by the fountain a lovely lady was sitting, who was the queen of the fairies. And she told the man that she had changed herself into a stag to bring him there because she loved him so much. Then she brought out a great gold cup covered with jewels from her fairy palace, and she offered him wine in the cup to drink. And he drank, and the more he drank, the more he longed to drink, because the wine was enchanted. So he kissed the lovely lady, and she became his wife. And he stayed all that day and all that night in the hill where she lived. And when he woke, he found he was lying on the ground, close to where he had seen the stag first, and his horse was there, and his hounds were there waiting. And he looked up, and the sun sank behind the mountain. And he went home and lived a long time, but he would never kiss any other lady because he had kissed the queen of the fairies, and he would never drink common wine any more because he had drunk enchanted wine. And sometimes Nurse told me tales that she had heard from her great-grandmother, who was very old and lived in a cottage on the mountain all alone, and most of these tales were about a hill where people used to meet at night long ago. And they used to play all sorts of strange games and do queer things that Nurse told me of, but I couldn't understand. And now, she said, everybody but her great-grandmother had forgotten all about it, and nobody knew where the hill was, not even her great-grandmother. But she told me one very strange story about the hill, and I trembled when I remembered it. She said that people always went there in summer when it was very hot, and they had to dance a good deal. It would be all dark at first, and there were trees there, which made it much darker, and people would come, one by one, from all directions, by a secret path which nobody else knew. And 2 persons would keep the gate, and every one as they came up had to give a very curious sign, which nurse showed me as well as she could, but she said she couldn't show me properly. And all kinds of people would come. There would be gentlefolks and village folks, and some old people, and boys and girls, and quite small children, who sat and watched. And it would be dark as they came in, except in one corner where someone was burning something that smelt strong and sweet and made them laugh, and there one would see a glaring of coals and the smoke mounting up red. So they would all come in, and when the last had come, there was no door any more, so that no one else could get in, even if they knew there was anything beyond. And once a gentleman, who was a stranger and had ridden a long way, lost his path at night, and his horse took him into the very middle of the wild country, where everything was upside down, and there were dreadful marshes and great stones everywhere, and holes underfoot, and the trees looked like gibbet posts, because they had great black arms that stretched out across the way. And this strange gentleman was very frightened, and his horse began to shiver all over, and at last it stopped and wouldn't go any farther. And the gentleman got down and tried to lead the horse, but it wouldn't move, and it was all covered with sweat like death. So the gentleman went on all alone, going farther and farther into the wild country, till at last he came to a dark place, where he heard shouting and singing and crying like nothing he had ever heard before. It all sounded quite close to him, but he couldn't get in, and so he began to call, and while he was calling, something came behind him, and in a minute his mouth and arms and legs were all bound up, and he fell into a swoon. And when he came to himself, he was lying by the roadside, just where he had first lost his way, under a blasted oak with a black trunk, and his horse was tied beside him. So he rode on to the town and told the people there what had happened, and some of them were amazed, but others knew. So, when once everybody had come, there was no door at all for anybody else to pass in by. And when they were all inside, round in a ring, touching each other, someone began to sing in the darkness, and someone else would make a noise like thunder with the thing they had on purpose, and on still nights people would hear the thundering noise far, far away beyond the wild land. And some of them, who thought they knew what it was, used to make a sign on their breasts when they woke up in their beds at the dead of the night and heard that terrible deep noise like thunder on the mountains. And the noise and the singing would go on and on for a long time, and the people who were in a ring swayed a little to and fro, and the song was in an old, old language that nobody knows now, and the tune was queer. Nurse said her great-grandmother had known someone who remembered a little of it when she was quite a little girl, and Nurse tried to sing some of it to me, and it was so strange a tune that I turned all cold and my flesh crept as if I had put my hand on something dead. Sometimes it was a man who sang, and sometimes it was a woman, and sometimes the one who sang it did it so well that 2 or 3 of the people who were there fell to the ground shrieking and tearing with their hands. The singing went on, and the people in the ring kept swaying to and fro for a long time. And at last the moon would rise over a place they called the Tol Deol, and came up and showed them swinging and swaying from side to side, with the sweet thick smoke curling up from the burning coals and floating in circles all around them. Then they had their supper. A boy and a girl brought it to them. The boy carried a great cup of wine, and the girl carried a cake of bread. And they passed the bread and wine round and round, but they tasted quite different from common bread and common wine, and changed everybody that tasted them. Then they all rose up and danced, and secret things were brought out of some hiding place, and they played extraordinary games, and danced round and round and round in the moonlight. And sometimes people would suddenly disappear and never be heard of afterwards, and nobody knew what had happened to them. And they drank more of that curious wine, and they made images and worshipped them. And Nurse showed me how the images were made one day when we were out for a walk, and we passed by a place where there was a lot of wet clay. So Nurse asked me if I would like to know what those things were like that they made on the hill, and I said yes. Then she asked me if I would promise never to tell a living soul a word about it, and if I did, I was to be thrown into the black pit with dead people. And I said I wouldn't tell anybody, and she said the same thing again and again, and I promised. So she took my wooden spade and dug a big lump of clay and put it in my tin bucket, and told me to say, if anyone met us, that I was going to make pies when I went home. Then we went on a little way, till we came to a little break growing right down into the road, and Nurse stopped and looked up the road and down it, and then peeped through the hedge into a field on the other side, and then she said, "Quick!" and we ran into the break, and crept in and out among the bushes till we had gone a good way from the road. Then we sat down under a bush, and I wanted so much to know what Nurse was going to make with the clay, but before she would begin, she made me promise again not to say a word about it, and she went again and peeped through the bushes on every side, though the lane was so small and deep that hardly anybody ever went there. So we sat down, and the Nurse took the clay out of the bucket and began to knead it with her hands, and do queer things with it, and turn it about. And she hid it under a big dock leaf for a minute or two, and then she brought it out again, and then she stood up and sat down and walked round the clay in a peculiar manner. And all the time she was singing softly a sort of rhyme, and her face got very red. Then she sat down again and took the clay in her hands and began to shape it into a doll, but not like the dolls I have at home. And she made the queerest doll I had ever seen, all out of the wet clay, and hid it under a bush to get dry and hard, and all the time she was making it she was singing these rhymes to herself, and her face got redder and redder. So we left the doll there, hidden away in the bushes where nobody would ever find it. And a few days later we went on the same walk, and when we came to that narrow, dark part of the lane where the break runs down to the bank, Nurse made me promise all over again, and she looked about just as she had done before, and we crept into the bushes till we got to the green place where the little clay man was hidden. I remember it all so well, though I was only 8, and it is 8 years ago now as I am writing it down. But the sky was a deep violet blue, and in the middle of the break, where we were sitting, there was a great elder tree covered with blossoms, and on the other side there was a clump of meadowsweet. And when I think of that day, the smell of the meadowsweet and elder blossoms seems to fill the room, and if I shut my eyes, I can see the glaring blue sky with little clouds, very white, floating across it, and the Nurse who went away long ago, sitting opposite me, and looking like the beautiful white lady in the wood. So we sat down, and Nurse took out the clay doll from the secret place where she had hidden it, and she said we must pay our respects, and she would show me what to do, and I must watch her all the time. She did all sorts of queer things with the little clay man, and I noticed she was all streaming with perspiration, though we had walked so slowly. And then she told me to pay my respects, and I did everything she said, because I liked her, and it was such an odd game. And she said that if one loved very much, the clay man was very good, if one did certain things with it, and if one hated very much, it was just as good, only one had to do different things. And we played with it a long time and pretended all sorts of things. Nurse said her great-grandmother had told her all about these images, but what we did was no harm at all, only a game. But she told me a story about these images that frightened me very much, and that was what I remembered that night when I was lying awake in my room in the pale, empty darkness, thinking of what I had seen and the secret wood. Nurse said there was once a young lady of the high gentry who lived in a great castle, and she was so beautiful that all the gentlemen wanted to marry her, because she was the loveliest lady that anybody had ever seen, and she was kind to everybody, and everybody thought she was very good. But though she was polite to all the gentlemen who wished to marry her, she put them off and said she couldn't make up her mind, and she wasn't sure she wanted to marry anybody at all. And her father, who was a very great lord, was angry, though he was so fond of her, and he asked her why she wouldn't choose a bachelor out of all the handsome young men who came to the castle. But she only said she didn't love any of them very much, and she must wait, and if they pestered her, she said she would go and be a nun in a nunnery. So all the gentlemen said they would go away and wait for a year and a day, and when a year and a day were gone, they would come back again and ask her to say which one she would marry. So the day was appointed, and they all went away, and the lady had promised that in a year and a day it would be her wedding day with one of them. But the truth was that she was the queen of the people who danced on the hill on summer nights, and on the proper nights she would lock the door of her room, and she and her maid would steal out of the castle by a secret passage that only they knew of, and go away up to the hill in the wild land. And she knew more of the secret things than of anyone else, and more than anyone knew before or after, because she would not tell anybody the most secret secrets. She knew how to do all the awful things, how to destroy young men, and how to put a curse on people, and other things that I could not understand. And her real name was the Lady Avelin, but the dancing people called her Kassap, which meant somebody very wise in the old language. And she was whiter than any of them, and taller, and her eyes shone in the dark like burning rubies, and she could sing songs that none of the others could sing, and when she sang, they all fell down on their faces and worshipped her. And she could do what they called shibsho, which was a very wonderful enchantment. She would tell the great lord her father that she wanted to go into the woods to gather flowers, so he let her go. And she and her maid went into the woods when nobody came, and the maid would keep watch. Then the lady would lie down under the trees and begin to sing a particular song, and she stretched out her arms, and from every part of the wood great serpents would come, hissing and gliding in, out among the trees, and shooting out their forked tongues as they crawled up to the lady. And they all came to her, and twisted round her body and her arms and her neck, till she was covered with writhing serpents, and there was only her head to be seen. And she whispered to them, and she sang to them, and they writhed round and round, faster and faster, till she told them to go. And they all went away directly, back to their holes, and on the lady's breast there would be a most curious, beautiful stone, shaped something like an egg, and coloured dark blue and yellow and red and green, marked like a serpent's scales. It was called a glame stone, and with it one could do all sorts of wonderful things. And the nurse said her great-grandmother had seen a glame stone with her own eyes, and it was for all the world shiny and scaly like a snake. And the lady could do a lot of other things as well, but she was quite fixed that she would not be married. And there were a great many gentlemen who wanted to marry her, but there were 5 of them who were chief, and their names were Sir Simon, Sir John, Sir Oliver, Sir Richard, and Sir Rowland. All the others believed she spoke the truth, and that she would choose one of them to be her man when a year and a day was done. It was only Sir Simon, who was very crafty, who thought she was deceiving them all, and he vowed he would watch and try if he could find out anything. And though he was very wise, he was very young, and he had a smooth, soft face like a girl's, and he pretended, as the rest did, that he would not come to the castle for a year and a day, and said he was going away beyond the sea to foreign parts. but he really only went a very little way, and came back dressed like a servant girl. And so he got a place in the castle to wash the dishes, and he waited, and watched, and he listened, and said nothing, and he hid in dark places, and woke up at night and looked out, and he heard things, and he saw things that he thought were very strange. And he was so sly that he told the girl that waited on the lady that he was really a young man, and that he had dressed up as a girl because he loved her so very much, and wanted to be in the same house with her. And the girl was so pleased that she told him many things, and he was more than ever certain that the Lady Aveline was deceiving him and the others. And he was so clever, and told the servant so many lies, that one night he managed to hide in the Lady Aveline's room behind the curtains, and he stayed quite still, and never moved. And at last the lady came, and she bent down under the bed, and raised up a stone, and there was a hollow place underneath, and out of it she took a waxen image, just like the clay one that I and the nurse had made in the break, and all the time her eyes were burning like rubies. And she took the little wax doll up in her arms and held it to her breast, and she whispered, and she murmured, and she took it up, and she laid it down again, and she held it high, and she held it low, and she laid it down again. And she said, Happy is he that begat the bishop, that ordered the clerk, that married the man, that had the wife, that fashioned the hive, that harboured the bee, that gathered the wax, that my own true love was made of. And she brought out of an aumbry a great golden bowl, and she brought out of a closet a great jar of wine, and she poured some of the wine into the bowl, and she laid her manikin very gently in the wine, and washed it in the wine all over. Then she went to a cupboard and took a small round cake and laid it on the image's mouth, and then she bore it softly and covered it up. And Sir Simon, who was watching all the time, though he was terribly frightened, saw the lady bend down and stretch out her arms and whisper and sing, and then Sir Simon saw beside her a handsome young man, who kissed her on the lips, and they drank wine out of the golden bowl together, and they ate the cake together. But when the sun rose, there was only the little wax doll, and the lady hid it again under the bed in the hollow place. So Sir Simon knew quite well what the lady was, and he waited, and he watched, till the time she had said was nearly over, and in a week the year and a day would be done. And one night, when he was watching behind the curtains in her room, he saw her making more wax dolls, and she made 5 and hid them away. And the next night she took one out and held it up, and filled the golden bowl with water, and took the doll by the neck and held it under the water. Then she said, Sir Dickon, your day is done. You shall be drowned in the water one. And the next day news came to the castle that Sir Richard had been drowned at the ford. And at night she took another doll, and tied a violet cord round its neck and hung it up on a nail. Then she said, Sir Roland, your life has ended its span. High on a tree I see you hang. And the next day news came to the castle that Sir Roland had been hanged by robbers in the wood. And at night she took another doll and drove her bodkin right into its heart. Then she said, Sir Noll, so cease your life, your heart pierced with the knife. And the next day news came to the castle that Sir Oliver had fought in a tavern, and a stranger had stabbed him to the heart. And at night she took another doll, and held it to a fire of charcoal till it was melted. Then she said, Sir John, return and turn to clay. In fire of fever you waste away. And the next day news came to the castle that Sir John had died in a burning fever. So then Sir Simon went out of the castle and mounted his horse and rode away to the bishop and told him everything. And the bishop sent his men, and they took the Lady Aveline, and everything she had done was found out. So on the day after the year and a day, when she was to have been married, they carried her through the town in her smock, and they tied her to a great stake in the market-place, and burned her alive before the bishop, with her wax image hung around her neck. And the people said the wax man screamed in the burning of the flames. And I thought of this story again and again as I was lying awake in my bed, and I seemed to see the Lady Aveline in the market-place, with the yellow flames eating up her beautiful white body, and I thought of it so much that I seemed to get into the story myself, and fancied I was the lady, and that they were coming to take me to be burned with fire, and all the people in the town looking at me. And I wondered whether she cared, after all the strange things she had done, and whether it hurt very much to be burned at the stake. I tried again and again to forget nurse's stories, and to remember the secret I had seen that afternoon, and what was in the secret wood. But I could only see the dark and a glimmering in the dark, and then it went away, and I only saw myself running, and then a great moon came up white over a dark round hill. Then all the stories came back again, and the queer rhymes that nurse used to sing to me. And there was one beginning, Halsey Cumsey Helen Musty, that she used to sing very softly when she wanted me to go to sleep. And I began to sing it to myself inside of my head. And I went to sleep. The next morning, I was very tired and sleepy and could hardly do my lessons, and I was very glad when they were over and I had my dinner, as I wanted to go out and be alone. It was a warm day, and I went to a nice turfy hill by the river, and sat down on my mother's old shawl that I had brought with me on purpose. The sky was grey like the day before, but there was a kind of white gleam behind it, and from where I was sitting I could look down on the town, and it was all still and quiet and white, like a picture. I remembered that it was on that hill that nurse taught me to play an old game called Troy Town, in which one had to dance and wind in and out on a pattern in the grass, and then, when one had danced and turned long enough, the other person asks you questions, and you can't help answering whether you want to or not, and whatever you were told to do, you feel you have to do it. Nurse said there used to be a lot of games like that some people knew of, and there was one by which people could be turned into anything you liked, and an old man her great-grandmother had seen had known a girl who had been turned into a large snake. And there was another very ancient game of dancing and winding and turning, by which you could take a person out of himself and hide him away as long as you liked, and his body went walking about quite empty, without any sense in it. But I came to that hill because I wanted to think of what had happened the day before, and of the secret of the wood. From the place where I was sitting, I could see beyond the town into the opening I had found, where a little brook had led me into an unknown country. And I pretended I was following the brook over again, and I went all the way in my mind, and at last I found the wood, and crept into it under the bushes, and then, in the dusk, I saw something that made me feel as if I were filled with fire, as if I wanted to dance and sing and fly up in the air because I was changed and wonderful. But what I saw was not changed at all, and had not grown old, and I wondered again and again how such things could happen, and whether nurse's stories were really true, because in the daytime, in the open air, everything seemed quite different from what it was at night, when I was frightened and thought I was about to be burned alive. I once told my father one of her little tales, which was about a ghost, and asked him if it was true, and he told me it was not true at all, and that only common, ignorant people believed in such rubbish. He was very angry with nurse for telling me the story, and scolded her, and after that I promised her I would never whisper a word of what she told me, and if I did, I should be bitten by the great black snake that lived in the pool in the wood. And all alone on the hill, I wondered what was true. I had seen something very amazing and very lovely, and I knew a story, and if I had really seen it and not made it up out of the dark and the black bough and the bright shining that was mounting up to the sky from over the great round hill, but had really seen it in truth, then there were all kinds of wonderful and lovely and terrible things to think of. So I longed and trembled, and I burned and got cold, and I looked down on the town, so quiet and still, like a little white picture, and I thought over and over if it could be true. I was a long time before I could make up my mind to anything. There was such a strange fluttering at my heart that seemed to whisper to me all the time that I had not made it up out of my head, and yet it seemed impossible, and I knew my father and everybody would say it was dreadful rubbish. I never dreamed of telling him or anybody else a word about it, because I knew it would be of no use, and I should only get laughed at or scolded. So for a long time I was very quiet, and went about thinking and wondering, and at night I used to dream of amazing things. And sometimes I woke up in the early morning and held out my arms with a cry, and I was frightened too, because there were dangers, and some awful thing would happen to me unless I took great care, if the story were true. These old tales were always in my head, night and morning, and I went over them and told them to myself over and over again, and went for walks in the places where nurse had told them to me. And when I sat in the nursery by the fire in the evenings, I used to fancy nurse was sitting in the other chair, and telling me some wonderful story in a low voice, for fear anybody should be listening. But she used to like best to tell me about things when we were right out in the country, far from the house, because she said she was telling me such secrets, and walls have ears. And if it was something more than ever secret, we had to hide in brakes or woods. And I used to think it was such fun creeping along a hedge and going very softly. And then we would get behind the bushes or run into the woods all of a sudden when we were sure that none was watching us, so that we knew that we had our secrets quite all to ourselves, and nobody else at all knew anything about them. Now and then, when we had hidden ourselves, as I have described, she used to show me all sorts of odd things. One day, I remember, we were in a hazel brake overlooking the brook, and we were so snug and warm as though it was April. The sun was quite hot, and the leaves were just coming out. Nurse said she would show me something funny that would make me laugh, and then she showed me, as she said, how one could turn a whole house upside down without anybody being able to find out, and the pots and pans would jump about, and the china would be broken, and the chairs would tumble over of themselves. I tried it one day in the kitchen, and I found I could do it quite well, and a whole row of plates on the dresser fell off, and cook's little work table tilted up and turned right over before her eyes, as she said. But she was so frightened and turned so white that I didn't do it again, as I liked her. And afterwards, in the hazel copse, when she had shown me how to make things tumbled about, she showed me how to make rapping noises, and I learnt how to do that too. Then she taught me rhymes to say on certain occasions, and peculiar marks to make on other occasions, and other things that her great-grandmother had taught her when she was a little girl herself. And these were all the things I was thinking about in those days after the strange walk, when I thought I had seen a great secret, and I wished nurse were there for me to ask her about it. But she had gone away more than 2 years before, and nobody seemed to know what had become of her, or where she had gone. But I shall always remember those days if I live to be quite old, because all the time I felt so strange, wondering and doubting, and feeling quite sure at one time, and making up my mind, and then I would feel quite sure that such things couldn't really happen, and it began all over again. But I took great care not to do certain things that might be very dangerous, so I waited and became sure that all that nurse said was quite true, and I was all alone when I found it out. I trembled all over with joy and terror, and as fast as I could I ran into one of the old brakes where we used to go. It was the one by the lane where the nurse made the little clay man, and I ran into it, and I crept into it, and when I came to the place where the elder was, I covered up my face with my hands and lay down flat on the grass, and I stayed there for 2 hours without moving, whispering to myself delicious, terrible things, and saying some words over and over again. It was all true and wonderful and splendid, and when I remembered the story I knew and thought of what I had really seen, I got hot and I got cold, and the air seemed full of scent and flowers and singing. And first I wanted to make a little clay man like the one nurse had made so long ago, and I had to invent plans and stratagems and to look about and to think of things beforehand, because nobody must dream of anything that I was doing or going to do, and I was too old to carry clay about in a tin bucket. At last I thought of a plan, and I brought the wet clay to the brake and did everything that nurse had done, only I made a much finer image than the one she had made. And when it was finished, I did everything that I could imagine and much more than she did, because it was the likeness of something far better. And a few days later, when I had done my lessons early, I went for the second time by the way of the little brook that had led me into a strange country. And I followed the brook and went through the bushes and beneath the low branches of trees, and up thorny thickets on the hill, and by dark woods full of creeping thorns, a long, long way. Then I crept through the dark tunnel where the brook had been and the ground was stony, till at last I came to the thicket that climbed up the hill, and though the leaves were coming out upon the trees, everything looked almost as black as it was on the first day that I went there. And the thicket was just the same, and I went up slowly till I came out on the bare big hill and began to walk among the wonderful rocks. I saw the terrible vour again on everything, for though the sky was brighter, the ring of wild hills all around was still dark, and the hanging woods looked dark and dreadful, and the strange rocks were grey as ever. And when I looked down on them from the great mound sitting on the stone, I saw all their amazing circles and rounds within rounds, and I had to sit quite still and watch them as they began to turn about me, and each stone danced in its place, and they seemed to go through the air. So I went down among the rocks to dance with them and to sing extraordinary songs, and I went down through the other thicket and drank from the bright stream in the close and secret valley, putting my lips down to the bubbling water, and then I went on till I came to the deep brimming well among the glittering moss, and I sat down. I looked before me into the secret darkness of the valley, and behind me was a great high wall of grass, and all around me were the hanging woods that made the valley such a secret place. I knew there was nobody here at all beside myself, and that no one could see me, so I took off my boots and stockings, and let my feet down into the water, saying the words that I knew. And it was not cold at all, as I expected, but warm and very pleasant, and when my feet were in it, I felt as if they were in silk, or as if the nymph were kissing them. So when I had done, I said the other words and made the signs. And then I dried my feet with a towel I had brought on purpose, and put on my stockings and boots. Then I climbed up the steep wall and went into the place where there are the hollows and the two beautiful mounds, and the round ridges of land, and all the strange shapes. I did not go down into the hollow this time, but I turned at the end, and made out the figures quite plainly, as it was lighter, and I had remembered the story I had quite forgotten before. And in the story, the two figures are called Adam and Eve, and only those who know the story understand what they mean. So I went on and on till I came to the secret wood, which must not be described, and I crept into it by the way I had found. And when I had gone about halfway, I stopped and turned round and got ready, and I bound the handkerchief tightly round my eyes, and made quite sure that I could not see at all, not a twig, nor the end of a leaf, nor the light of the sky, as it was an old red silk handkerchief with large yellow spots, that went round twice and covered my eyes, so that I could see nothing. Then I began to go on, step by step, very slowly. My heart beat faster and faster, and something rose in my throat that choked me and made me want to cry out, but I shut my lips and went on. Boughs caught in my hair as I went, and great thorns tore me, but I went on to the end of the path. Then I stopped and held out my arms and bowed, and I went round the first time, feeling with my hands, and there was nothing. I went round the second time, feeling with my hands, and there was nothing. Then I went round the third time, feeling with my hands, and the story was all true. And I wished that the years were gone by, and that I had not so long a time to wait before I was happy, for ever and ever. Nurse must have been a prophet, like those we read of in the Bible. Everything that she said began to come true, and since then other things that she told me of have happened. That was how I came to know that her stories were true, and that I had not made up the secret myself, out of my own head. But there was another thing that happened that day. I went a second time to the secret place. It was at the deep brimming well, and when I was standing on the moss, I bent over and looked in. And then I knew who the white lady was that I had seen come out of the water in the wood long ago, when I was quite little. And I trembled all over, because that told me other things. Then I remembered how some time after I had seen the white people in the wood, Nurse asked me more about them, and I told her all over again, and she listened and said nothing for a long, long time. And at last she said, "You will see her again." So I understood what had happened, and what was to happen. And I understood about the nymphs, how I might meet them in all kinds of places, and they would always help me, and I must always look for them and find them in all sorts of strange shapes and appearances. And without the nymphs, I could never have found the secret, and without them none of the other things could happen. Nurse had told me all about them long ago, but she called them by another name, and I did not know what she meant, or what her tales of them were about, only that they were very queer. And there were two kinds, the bright and the dark, and both were very lovely and very wonderful. And some people saw only one kind, and some only the other, but some saw them both. But usually the dark appeared first, and the bright ones came afterwards, and there were extraordinary tales about them. It was a day or two after I had come home from the secret place that I first really knew the nymphs. Nurse had shown me how to call them, and I had tried, but I did not know what she meant, and so I thought it was all nonsense. But I made up my mind I would try again, so I went to the wood where the pool was, where I saw the white people, and I tried again. The dark nymph Alana came, and she turned the pool of water into a pool of fire. Epilogue. "That's a very queer story," said Cotgrave, handing back the green book to the recluse Ambrose. "I see the drift of a good deal, but there are many things that I do not grasp at all. On the last page, for example, what does she mean by nymphs?" "Well, I think there are references throughout the manuscript to certain processes which have been handed down by tradition from age to age. Some of these processes are just beginning to come within the purview of science, which has arrived at them, or rather at the steps which lead to them, by quite different paths. I have interpreted the reference to nymphs as a reference to one of those processes." "And you believe that there are such things?" "Oh, I think so. Yes, I believe I could give you convincing evidence on that point. I'm afraid you have neglected the study of alchemy. It's a pity, for the symbolism, at all events, is very beautiful. And moreover, if you were acquainted with certain books on the subject, I could recall to your mind phrases which might explain a good deal in the manuscript that you have been reading." "Yes, but I want to know whether you seriously think that there's any foundation of fact beneath these fancies. Is it not all a department of poetry, a curious dream with which man has indulged himself?" "I can only say that it is no doubt better for the great mass of people to dismiss it all as a dream. But if you ask my veritable belief, that goes quite the other way. No, I should not say belief, but rather knowledge. I may tell you that I have known cases in which men have stumbled quite by accident on certain of these processes, and have been astonished by wholly unexpected results. In the cases I'm thinking of, there could have been no possibility of suggestion or subconscious action of any kind. One might as well suppose a schoolboy suggesting the existence of Aeschylus to himself while he plods mechanically through the declensions. But you have noticed the obscurity," Ambrose went on, "and in this particular case it must have been dictated by instinct, since the writer never thought that her manuscripts would fall into other hands. But the practice is universal, and for most excellent reasons. Powerful and sovereign medicines, which are of necessity virulent poisons also, are kept in a locked cabinet. The child may find the key by chance and drink herself dead, but in most cases the search is educational, and the files contain precious elixirs for him who has patiently fashioned the key for himself. You do not care to go into details? No, frankly, I do not. No, you must remain unconvinced. But you saw how the manuscript illustrates the talk we had last week. Is this girl still alive? No, I was one of those who found her. I knew the father well. He was a lawyer, and had always left her very much to herself. He thought of nothing but deeds and leases, and the news came to him as an awful surprise. She was missing one morning. I suppose it was about a year after she had written what you have read. The servants were called, and they told things, and put the only natural interpretation on them, a perfectly erroneous one. They discovered that green book somewhere in her room, and I found her in the place that she described with so much dread, lying on the ground before the image. It was an image. Yes, it was hidden by the thorns and the thick undergrowth that had surrounded it. It was a wild, lonely country. But you know what it was like by her description, though of course you will understand that the colours have been heightened. A child's imagination always makes the heights higher and the depths deeper than they really are. And she had, unfortunately for herself, something more than imagination. One might say, perhaps, that the picture in her mind, which she succeeded in a measure in putting into words, was the scene as it would have appeared to an imaginative artist. But it is a strange, desolate land. And she was dead. Oh, yes. She had poisoned herself, in time. No, there was not a word to be said against her in the ordinary sense. You may recollect a story I told you the other night about a lady who saw her child's fingers crushed by a window. And what was this statue? Well, it was of Roman workmanship, of a stone that with the centuries had not blackened, but had become white and luminous. The thicket had grown up about it and concealed it, and in the Middle Ages the followers of a very old tradition had known how to use it for their own purposes. In fact, it had been incorporated into the monstrous mythology of the Sabbath. You will have noted that those to whom a sight of that shining whiteness had been vouchsafed by chance, or rather, perhaps by apparent chance, were required to blindfold themselves on their second approach. That is very significant. And is it there still? I sent for tools, and we hammered it into dust and fragments. The persistence of tradition never surprises me, Ambrose went on after a pause. I could name many an English parish where such traditions as that girl had listened to in her childhood are still existent in occult but unabated vigour. No, for me it is the story, not the sequel, which is strange and awful. For I have always believed that wonder is of the soul.